that is a very, very radical geopolitical shift as the United States looks to develop minerals processing capacity outside of China. And so the impact of all of this, is going to be huge in terms of the flow of materials all around the world. 20% of rare earth production and permanent magnet production is in China. So as soon as you start to realize that, look at electric vehicles. So you haven't replaced the petrol in your car with sunshine or wind. Instead, you're replacing it with the battery potential. So, and how do you make the battery? I think the tariffs themselves, as you say, are a very blunt instrument. And the impact that they've had so far has been very paralyzing on global trade. But there are other mechanisms that could be developed that would be much more positive in terms of developing those supply chains. Over many years, there have been very few mines constructed in the United States and in Europe. And even now, we've seen recently in Serbia a huge amount of resistance to the development of Rio Tinto's lithium project there. And that is because mining has sort of fallen out of the consciousness of people, and it's seen as a dirty and extracting industry.
All right, today with me is Guy Winter. He's a partner at Global Mining Group at Fasken. Fasken is actually an international law firm with offices all over the world, and they've been dealing with different types of minerals, including critical minerals. So today we're going to talk to him about his personal journey, where I guess law firms going with the whole shift to critical minerals, and how does he see the future in that regard. So Guy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Great to see you, Anya.
Well, first question, I guess, just what drew you to the energy sector specifically? How did you end up in this?
I often
industry?
ask myself that same question. I think, what we've had, Anya, over the last 20 years has been this incredible renewables revolution in the energy sector. The biggest upheaval to global energy use and industry since the Industrial Revolution. And, that's really been an amazing transition to be part of over the last 20 years. But also the oil and gas sector, which defined the previous 2 centuries. And, in the case of gas, it still obviously has a massive role as a transition fuel. And here the industry has adapted massively, for example, through technological innovations like fracking, and also pushing out the frontiers of the industry to the most remote parts of the world. So, there again, you can see it's been an incredibly dynamic and innovative period in the industry.
And I remember talking to you, and I think my colleague were talking to you. You were mentioned that you're one of the last energy lawyers, I guess, today. What does it mean to you, and what do you mean by that?
Well, I guess that there probably aren't so many oil and gas lawyers left around these days. We've obviously had a long period of transition. There's probably a new breed of renewables lawyers. And, that is a very dynamic, collaborative market to work in. One of the things that's been really interesting is the different players that have come into the energy world. So from the old days where it would be a group of oil and gas companies and big power producers, you now have big tech, playing an incredibly important role. And I know K-Mine is obviously a good example of how, technology can really disrupt an old economy sector and find better ways of doing things. You see people like the big technology companies, the big internet companies, really coming up with some disruptive models. And artificial intelligence is a great example of a technology that has brought a lot of different players into the sector. So the people who are the modern AI, the modern energy and mining executives do look at a lot different from those of 25 years ago.
Right, but how? I guess if we're talking about specifically legal framework, how did it shift over the years, and where is the focus right now, and where do you see it in the future?
Yeah, so obviously, the world went through a very long period where growth was essentially driven by fossil fuels. So the incredible energy potential within coal and oil and gas, and that unlocked a huge amount of progress and development. Now, what we've obviously seen with climate change and a much stronger drive for air quality, for sustainability, for protecting the environment, it is a sort of new paradigm where the energy sector now, and the mining sector as well, as a supply chain to energy, is really kind of defined by the energy trilemma. So now these sectors have got to deliver sustainability, they've got to deliver affordability, and they also have to deliver security of supply. And so, in the current environment that we're in, with incredible geopolitical pressures at play as well, balancing those three factors is ever more difficult, because security of supply becomes much more difficult when you can't rely on supply chains, because suddenly gas from Russia may be cut off, because suddenly China may decide to stop supplying rare earths to Western industrial players. So it really is a very sort of pressurized environment, and the regulators have to respond to those pressures. So what you see, for example, is sustainability obviously taking a very important place in Western supply chains. And that's really likely to be a continuing trend in at least in Europe, with carbon border mechanisms, for example. And the EU battery regulation is a good example of a really important piece of regulation in the industry that is going to drive much higher sustainability standards. Um, Now, what we also have, of course, is a kind of competing tension between the Trump, the Republican style deregulation, and what you might call the anti ESG agenda, and a kind of continuing focus in Europe on environmental factors. And we've also seen, of course, resource nationalism coming into play in various places around the world. And I think there's this trend of having greater regulatory intervention is likely to continue as people focus on capturing that value within their own geography and area of influence. So one example which I would give you, which is very much being discussed at the moment, is in waste. So waste has been seen, secondary materials have been seen as something to get rid of as best you can, ship it to China. Whereas now a lot of countries are saying, this is actually a valuable secondary material. We must capture the value from this within our own country, and we shouldn't just be shipping it away.
How does the politics of new U.S. administration affect what you do at Fasken? And is there anything that you have to take into consideration from the legal perspective, planning ahead, whether, let's say now there are rumors that actually it will be 4 more years, after that. So what's happening in terms of this uncertainty from the legal perspective?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a very interesting question. And obviously, there are a huge number of implications for a huge number of different markets. It's obviously quite a sensitive question, for us as a Canadian headquartered law firm. The Canadian energy sector is very much focused on exporting energy and indeed oil and gas to the United States. Now, in actual fact, that has been a very important card for Canada in its negotiations with the United States, because those resources are so important. Also, though, you can see that there's going to be a very significant change in the way that those resources flow in the future, because you'll expect to see that Canada is going to look to diversify so that it has a much broader base. And so I would expect to see the projects that they have in Canada focused on, for example, LNG export and hydrocarbon pipelines to the east coast of Canada to be very much expedited under the new Carney prime ministership. But also, there's obviously very significant implications in terms of critical minerals. So we know that the US government is investigating the impact of critical minerals imports into the United States. They're also looking at the copper market. Now, the likelihood is that they're going to consider that they're going to have to introduce some tariffs on those materials, which are currently not subject to tariffs during the investigation. And that's because what they want to do is to create an incentive for people to develop those projects within the United States. And we've already seen just last week a very interesting development, which was rare earths has been a big area of focus. China has imposed export controls in retaliation for the United States tariffs on certain heavy rare earths. And so what we've seen is the United States currently has no processing capability for heavy rare earths. They do, however, have some mines, and the Mountain Pass mine in California, operated by MP Materials, is a very significant source of rare earth. And they've announced a joint venture with Ma'aden in Saudi Arabia, whereby the Saudis will use the huge capital that they have from oil and gas production to build a processing capability in rare earth. So that is a very, very radical geopolitical shift as the United States looks to develop minerals processing capacity outside of China. And so the impact of all of this, is going to be huge in terms of the flow of materials all around the world. Mm-hmm. And I think all of the different regions, you mentioned the Ukraine deal with the United States, what this is really bringing is a new era of competition for resources. And so we can expect to see all of the geopolitical blocs looking to proactively secure their own access to these vital minerals. And I think in the US, their approach is through tariffs in order to drive domestic capacity. And they're looking to relax the ESG rules that relate to mining and developing new projects. In the EU, they're taking a very different approach, which is to actually use ESG as a barrier to entry. So setting very high standards for the material that can be used in EU battery manufacturing. And you'd expect to see that driving more Chinese manufacturing into the EU. And in the case of China, they obviously have been using critical minerals as a sort of weapon in their own trade war with the United States. And at the moment, these export controls have had a very significant effect on European supply chains.
Yeah, well, I think they recently reached some 90-day agreement with China. So there is like another whole chapter of uncertainty after what will happen after this 90 days. It will be interesting to see what's going on. But how, I guess, lawyers just prepare to what's coming up, if they even can prepare to that, especially in the UK, since that's where you are.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously the UK, is a very significant centre of legal services, and a lot of international agreements will be documented under English law. For us as a law firm, the Canadian position is also very significant because there is a serious impact for Canadian supplies of energy and raw materials if these United States tariffs apply. And so one exercise that a lot of our clients have been going through all over the world is reviewing all of their contracts for the supply of energy and critical materials because what you're looking to establish is what's the impact on the contractual obligations if there is suddenly a tariff imposed, which might double the cost of the material to the importer. So does that mean that you can terminate the supply of the contract, what they call a force majeure clause, so you can suspend the supply until such time as the situation is more regularized? And then again, in M&A transactions, Anya, if a deal was already agreed, does it still have to go through if the economics of the transaction are hugely distorted by, for example, tariffs or export controls? So there's a lot of planning that suppliers of material have to go through. I think we're going to see a lot of consideration in contracts going forward as to how long people are willing to contract for in such an uncertain environment. And so, over many years, you've seen a lot of different pricing models, long-term offtake contracts to spot pricing models. At the moment, you would feel very nervous about going into a long-term fixed price contract in a situation where there's essentially a trade war going on between two of the biggest economic blocs in the world.
Yeah, that will be my next question. What are the most popular adjustments that was currently are happening with the contracts that maybe you personally or your partners work on? And I guess, yeah, that would be the question. What will be the adjustments, and what has changed?
Well, the one that certainly isn't popular with us or indeed the parties is people terminating their contracts. But obviously that has been an issue. We have seen a number of situations where people have invoked force majeure or purported to terminate their contracts because the supply arrangements just don't make any sense in the current environment. And so, for example, you've seen, I already referred to MP Materials, the Mountain Pass rare earth project in the US. And so they have announced that they're not going to export material to be refined in China anymore. Now, the reasoning for that is pretty clear because obviously, under the current environment, the last thing they want to do is for the US taxpayer to subsidize the production of the mining of rare earths that will then be shipped to supply the Chinese processing plants. So that's probably the most extreme case where you see trading arrangements broken off completely. But I think, clearly in a lesser case, what you're going to be doing is trying to build more flexibility into your contracts to enable you to renegotiate the prices if there is some sort of unforeseen impact in terms of tariffs. And that's something that, makes a lot of sense to be looking at. The other thing you have to bear in mind is, do the markets still work under these circumstances? So there's been a lot of distortion of the traded prices for minerals where there is a spot market. And, this is something that has been going on for several years. There was a great nickel crisis in 2022 where the LME market essentially blew up and, the price increased by several 100% in a couple of days of trading. They had to shut down the market. Now, that led to some very high-profile litigation because obviously when the market was suspended and they had to unwind trades because the market had ceased to operate, many of the counterparties brought legal action. So all of these are kind of factors that now have to be considered when you're entering into supply contracts for these materials.
Any additional clauses that usually are not included in contracts like that now are considered?
Well, it's probably more clauses that we didn't think about so much that you now look at quite differently. So I think that force majeure, that is something that maybe people had become quite relaxed about, and it had a reasonably developed form. But now I think you have to consider a very new set of circumstances where you are essentially under trade war conditions. Now, typically, historically, force majeure was considered to exclude a situation like an increase in cost, so a purely economic effect. But can people afford to work to that? Maybe you have to have a different type of clause which will say, if there is such a significant tariff imposed, that enables you to renegotiate the price or suspend supply until the situation reaches a landing. So I think you're right. What we can expect to see is, firstly, we're going to see a lot of litigation. So there's going to be some new law that comes out of it. But also we can probably expect to see some new refinements in the way that people draft contracts of this nature.
And if we talk more detailed about critical minerals, how does it intersect with energy law, and just what is the additional challenges, I guess, it brings to this industry?
Yeah. So I guess one of the things that has been most interesting and perhaps was neglected a little bit in the early days of energy transition was that people thought we used to use hydrocarbons, we used to use coal and oil and gas, and we're going to replace this with sunshine and wind. And obviously that's a lovely idea, but it doesn't really reflect the underlying economics of the sector. Because in actual fact, you're not replacing, it's not a direct replacement of hydrocarbons with sunshine and wind. It's actually, you have to think about the minerals that go into producing the new energy infrastructure. So if you take a wind turbine, for example, the direct drive, wind turbines, so they're not geared systems. So they use incredibly powerful permanent magnets. How do you make those permanent magnets? Well, you make them from rare earths. And 90% of rare earth production and permanent magnet production is in China. So as soon as you start to realize that, look at electric vehicles. So you haven't replaced the petrol in your car with sunshine or wind. Instead, you're replacing it with the battery potential. So, and how do you make the battery? Well, most commonly it's either a nickel, cobalt, manganese, and lithium battery, or a lithium iron phosphate battery. So all of this is requiring huge amounts of mineral input. And then to your point about regulation, in the early days, no one worried too much about where those materials came from. But over time, if you look at the sustainability of your electric vehicle, if it is mined using cobalt, if it's produced using cobalt that's made from child labor in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or nickel that comes from Indonesia, it might actually have a very significant environmental footprint. And so what we've seen now is the same types of ESG considerations that you would have seen in the oil and gas sector now being introduced into the mining sector to look at exactly what the carbon footprint and the sustainability of this material really is.
If we dig deeper towards the subject of environmental concerns, I think now more than ever, people actually start talking about the environmental impact of so-called green energy. I guess it started with Trump saying something that he will be psychologist of the whales or something, because but it is an issue that we these wind turbines, that they actually have quite significant environmental impact. Same with solar panels; it's very hard to recycle them. So any new was added on this actually sector of the contracts, where actually people that look to do projects like that, they have to be more careful about how they will reclaim the project and how they will manage it in the end of the life cycle.
Yeah, so I mean, And that's exactly right. So there's obviously a lot more focus now on what the overall environmental footprint of the project will be. And so there's a lot more focus in right across the sector in terms of what you're going to do with the materials at the end of the project. So, for example, in a battery storage project, how are you going to recycle the materials once the batteries have reached the end of their operating life? And I think that is probably one of the biggest changes since the sector has matured to looking at that overall environmental impact. And what you see in the EU, for example, under the Critical Raw Materials Act, there's now a requirement for a minimum percentage of recycled material to be used in making batteries within the EU. So all of this is trying to push towards a truly sustainable product to make sure that when you're driving your Tesla, you are actually helping the environment rather than damaging it further.
Well, being green and being sustainable are kind of like also two different things, right? Like people also say, okay, if you want to be sustainable, if you want to help your planet, actually don't buy a new car.
Yeah.
Like buy a used car, right, and use it until it's done. But also, speaking of actual miners that work on this, anything new on that part? What kind of like key legal hurdles do they face today, especially those that actually work in critical mineral sector?
So I think the thing that has been particularly striking, Anya, about the latest development is, so here we are in a situation where China has this absolute control of the critical minerals, supply chain. And the most important part is actually not in the mining, but in the processing and refining, because in many cases, these are extremely difficult materials to refine. So lithium is famously a very difficult chemical process. Rare earths, heavy rare earths, that's an incredibly complex and historically dirty process to go through. So that's why the West has outsourced all of this production to China in the first place. Now what we see is the Americans and the Europeans trying to claim back more of this industry. And that has proved extremely challenging because over many years, there have been very few mines constructed in the United States and in Europe. And even now, we've seen recently in Serbia a huge amount of resistance to the development of Rio Tinto's lithium project there. And that is because mining has sort of fallen out of the consciousness of people, and it's seen as a dirty and extracting industry. Whereas obviously in China, with central government, they have imposed that, and it's been possible for them to build that infrastructure. So what we see now is there's huge legal hurdles for people in terms of permitting and getting the relevant consents to drive it through. Now, whatever you think about Donald Trump, and probably neither of us are politicians, there's something true in what he says, which is we must expedite the processes to achieve this. You can't rebuild industry if it takes 15 years to build a mine. And, there's a whole lost generation in the United States, for example, because no one has been involved in constructing new mines during that period. And even in Canada, which is, very much a mining jurisdiction, perhaps together with Western Australia, one of the most sophisticated mining provinces in the world, it is difficult and time consuming to get through all of the legal hurdles to go through that permitting. And so what we've seen recently in the EU, they've approved 47 strategic projects. And the idea will be to cut through all of the red tape and expedite the planning, the consenting, the environmental permitting, and all of that in order to get mines built and operating much more quickly. But to be quite frank with you as a lawyer, I really find it hard to see how much time they will be able to cut off in an environment where people are just going to bring legal actions if they don't want to have the mine nearby them. So there's going to have to be quite a profound cultural change in terms of how people see mining as a matter of national security, as a matter of jobs and industry, than the way that they currently see it in Europe.
If we connect this with nationalism in terms of the critical minerals and just the resources in general, how does it shape just the global demand? If we're talking about, like, I think now even more, well, United States for sure, but maybe even other countries try to actually focus on their national resources and develop them. So if we're talking about that, plus legal hurdles that they can face with the permitting issues, ESG issues, and other questions that you brought up, how does it intersect and where does it go? Like, where is it going?
In terms of the legal process, I mean,
yeah.
I mean, I think the biggest issue that we have is currently the fact that the market doesn't respond necessarily to the long-term demand that there is for these minerals. Because if you actually look at the prices today for lithium, for rare earths, for copper, for cobalt, none of them are actually sending a price signal that you should go out and build more mines. So even though we know that security of supply is a massive issue, the prices don't actually support the free market to go out and construct these mines. And the reason for that lies very much within what we already discussed in terms of the stranglehold that China has over the processing. So essentially, and in the case of nickel, Indonesia, these countries are very much incentivized to keep prices sufficiently low to stop more expensive projects from being built in the West. So one of the real challenges for governments in the West who see a strategic requirement for these materials is how they get people to build them in a price environment where you would never do it in terms of the pricing. And that's where the ESG aspect is super important, Tanya, because if you want to build something new, you can either have a carrot or a stick. And so they either have to incentivize people by providing them with funding to build the projects and maybe offtake support to guarantee a certain level of return from building the project, or they need to use a stick and say, if you use material that is not environmentally friendly from China, from Indonesia, then we're going to tax you. And we're going to use, if you use material that's sourced in a very carbon intensive way, we're going to tax it when it comes in to the EU's borders. And so that is the sort of process that we're seeing all over the world. Now, Donald Trump wants to use tariffs as a wall, and so he's very much using a stick to beat importers and in order to build American capacity.
But it doesn't really work. Like, I think he started these tariffs when, in March, like in the end of March, what is it, like Liberation Day, April 2nd was? And I think now, almost 2 months later, it doesn't look like this approach works. Like, stick approach doesn't look like it works. So can you reflect more about actually how government can secure this stable mineral access and resource nationalism at the same time?
Yeah. So
from legal perspective,
I mean, I think it may be too early to evaluate. We can see that the tariff the tariff saga has had a negative impact on global trade. It may be too early to establish whether it's had a positive impact on US manufacturing. I mean, as I say, there is a point there, which is that if you can't trust, to choose one example, China, to supply you with materials for your critical industries, then you have to find a way to incentivize your own domestic sectors to spring up. Now, the US have chosen.
But if you don't have minerals, you don't have minerals. I don't think, United States even have like magnesium, let's say, mines. Like
They have huge amounts of materials there. What they don't currently have are the mines and the processing capacity that they would need. And so, to your question as to how you incentivize that, I mean, I would say that there's a lot that can be done in terms of working on expediting the permitting and consents in order to move the projects through. But also, there's a lot that can be done. For example, if you try to create a floor price at a certain level, that will give investors the belief that it's possible to finance a project. Because if I know that there's going to be a minimum level of pricing for whatever the mineral may be, then that's a financeable proposition. So I think there are mechanisms that can be developed. I think the tariffs themselves, as you say, are a very blunt instrument, and the impact that they've had so far has been very paralyzing on global trade. But there are other mechanisms that could be developed that would be much more positive in terms of developing those supply chains. And if you look, for example, at the MP Materials Marden deal, to me, that's an example of a new globalization. So it's essentially saying we're going to have a kind of modified globalization where we are partnering with friendly nations. And I think that's going to be the case. I expect to see, for example, Canada and the United Kingdom looking for ways to collaborate because they're geopolitical allies. The UK has got high-tech industries and capital. Canada has got a huge level of raw materials and also some very interesting, industry, for example, in the automotive sector. So you could see that there's win-wins that countries will be able to come up with, and it's a different type of international collaboration.
How does it, the new developments, how does it intertwine with ESG factors? Because I feel like before this whole tariff war, people had almost like this virtuous signaling about like ESG, that our company is like super compliant, and there was like this huge awakening about how it impacts environment. And I feel like maybe it's because I live in the United States. I feel like now it's less imposed just because of the politics of the new administration. So what's happening now? Are companies still kind of like embrace this ESG factor, or are they just like, okay, I know that in order to comply with NI 43-101, for example, I need to check these boxes, so I'll do that, but whatever. How's it going?
I mean, it's a very interesting question because it seems to me that there's been a huge regulatory divergence between the United States and the European Union. And so probably the UK is, we're rather closer to the EU in terms of how we see that ESG driver. I think Canada is also closer to the EU and to the UK in terms of seeing that ESG as not really a virtue signaling exercise, but actually a really fundamental building block of business. So, and I think ultimately we have to be clear that and I don't want to stray into politics too far anyway, but the US administration's view that economic success is driven by drilling and burning things, it is slightly hard to reconcile with the actual environmental costs that we're seeing from climate change, from catastrophic events, even within the United States, to say nothing of its wider impact on the world as a whole. So I think the view, certainly on this side of the world, is going to continue to be that is a fundamental part of doing business. And you will see that the EU is the biggest trading bloc in the world, and you won't be able to build batteries for automotive in the EU unless you have followed high standards of ESG compliance. Now, this isn't entirely an altruistic thing, Anya, because obviously ESG can also be a barrier to entry. So, in many ways, it's driving the competitiveness of EU companies because it is making it more costly for polluting companies to do business in the EU. So I think, to your point, whilst we see and the US administration putting enormous pressure on companies and fund managers to desert ESG principles, that is not going to happen on this side of the world, because I think there is this commitment to ensuring that the long-term sustainability is part of the business model. And so we see accounting standards, stock exchange requirements will continue to drive that level of compliance. But also, young people not really accepting, won't go to work for these companies if mining companies are, polluting monsters. You won't be able to get the talent to compete. And if you look at the talent that you need, now you need.
I guess depends where you live.
Yeah.
If you need to survive, you're gonna work for any company, especially if there is, especially if there is no jobs, for example. Or,
but we're talking here, Anya, about the very top talent that is emerging. Do they, the mining industry is competing with many other sectors. It's competing with big tech. How do you get the best talent to drive your future in a scenario where, we've seen artificial intelligence in exploration, for example, become much more significant and much more of a selling point for mining companies. So they can't afford to be perceived as old economy dinosaurs.
Right. Coming back to critical minerals, how do you see that they actually, since it's actually not a big chunk of the market yet, at least, do you see that will keep developing and the market will actually respond to that, or do you see that, well, actually it might be some transition period and something else will emerge?
Yeah, I think the thing that's interesting is what is considered a critical mineral is evolving very rapidly. So sometimes people, for example, see that as a proxy for battery minerals, which are very small sectors, as you say. So clearly, cobalt, historically is a tiny mineral, a tiny market. Nickel has historically been used and continues to be used much more in steel production than in batteries. The interesting thing, though, is that we now see, for example, copper. Copper is essential for electrification, because as soon as you electrify energy or transport, you're going to use a huge amount more copper than you used before. Aluminium, which is probably the most obvious substitute for copper. And then even increasingly we're seeing steel. So steel is being treated now in various places as a critical mineral, because it's so essential for the development of steel. So iron that goes into steel production.
Okay.
and so as soon as you start to look at it in that way, these are much more significant markets that people are looking at and looking to protect their access to the materials. And even where you have rare earths, say, where that really is a tiny market, at the same time the applications are so essential for national security that countries can't really afford to ignore those in terms of their national interests.
Right. What is the, speaking of just careers and where it's all going, what is the most exciting legal specialties that would be emerging in the next decades to come? What would you advise to people that want to do what you do?
Yeah.
What sector would you advise them to go?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting question. I mean, obviously, I've left it a bit late, Anya, to retrain myself. But I think what's been really interesting for us in the energy and natural resources sector, obviously, that is a sort of classic. Historically, it was a very old economy sector. But what we've seen is very disruptive forces come through from technology. And as we touched upon, K-mine is a example of a different way of doing things, right? A more efficient way of doing things. And so I think data analytics, for example, is a hugely significant aspect of the energy world now. And so, we advised a really interesting, exciting company called Modo Energy, and they don't have any energy production themselves or even energy storage. But what they are providing is the data analytics for battery storage so that you can see how to make money in that sector, how to optimize the use of your battery storage to make sure that you're using it most efficiently. And so these types of kind of data driven processes and technologies have become a lot more significant over the past few years. So that would be an area. And so you never would have thought that there would be a big role for tech guys, technology lawyers in the energy and natural resources sector, but now that's a huge thing. And AI, that is an area where, so some people are a bit cynical about it still, and I can understand that, but the reality is that you've seen companies like Cobalt Metals who have an AI driven exploration strategy achieve a huge amount of funding from very sophisticated investors, and they've been much more successful in raising capital in the market than traditional mining companies. And so you've got to think that the next generation of lawyers in the sector will be very conversant with all of these technologies and how to manage the risks as they're involved in the mining and energy sectors.
Do you think AI can replace lawyers?
Well, I mean, I think that's already happening, in a big way. And so obviously you have to be very careful with how you use it. But, the reality is that Google Law is already a thing. So, you can you can put your question in and you'll get a pretty good answer. So for my profession, the big question will be how you help to essentially to program those parameters, to train it, and the ethics around that. And so a lot of the tasks that we used to spend a lot of time doing in terms of conducting enormous projects of reviewing contracts, these will just be reviewed by AI electronically in the future. So law has to continue to develop ways to add value, and obviously a lot of that will be through helping the development of that legal technology. And then a lot of it will be the ethics of how you shape AI in that sector.
Well, AI can't argue the case in the court.
No.
That's one thing that it can't replace, at least for now. It's all depends on not only, I guess, the loopholes that you can and aspects that you can angle the case, but also depend on your charisma as a person, right, and things like that. But in terms of just AI specifically, what kind of areas and specialties in the legal world can be applied there? What are the areas of expertise that people can train to actually recognize what AI does and deal with it? And Yeah.
Yeah, well,
Obviously.
I don't want to stray too far without my outside of my my capabilities here, Anya, because
Yeah.
really that is quite a. Already there are, specialists in legal tech who are sort of coming through developing these. So we probably see more, in terms of what we do. We're certainly using it to help improve the efficiency of our practice. I mean, I think from my practice, we probably see more of how it is being introduced in the mining sector to help reduce the cost of exploration, because exploration has traditionally been an incredibly expensive, labor intensive, time consuming process. So the more that you can use data to do some of that lifting and to join up the gaps in the information that you have, then you can really reduce the cost very significantly for the industry.
I also know that you're a writer. I haven't read your books yet.
Yeah.
Do you apply any of the things that you learn in mining sector or legal sector into your books, or is it?
Well, some more than others. Different? Some more than others. So definitely in my latest book, Tanya, there's a very much a critical minerals theme that underlies it. So it's in fact specifically in the lithium sector. So it combines both of my passions for critical minerals and for writing.
What is the name of the book?
So it's Billionaire Suicide Club.
Oh, Billionaire Suicide Club. All right. Well, I hope to check it out. Well, thank you so much, Guy, for your insights. It was very interesting. I hope we can do it again. And yeah, thank you for your time.
Great to speak, as always, Anya.